As our first month of the summer series, Blessed Flexibility, wraps up, I continue. Flexible was wise. Definitely been week one, we explored the idea of the world. Speaking of psychological flexibility, it is the ability to be present in the moment with full awareness and openness to our experience and to take action guided by our values. Put more simply, it's the ability to be present, open up, and do what matters. The second week was about letting go and letting God, the process of taking our trouble to God. Those conversations we replay in our head, imagining different outcomes or wishing we had responded differently. The relationships with friends or family that have a little too much of things swept under the carpet. We do that in an attempt to keep peace or dodge bullets. But when I see those people in person or their name comes up on my phone, sometimes I have that little wincing moment where I brace myself and it just doesn't sit right. So simply ignoring conflicts in the hopes that it resolves somehow is not very realistic. Resentment is a place where we get stuck, reliving, replaying, returning to a past experience. Stuck. We talked about a path out of that sticky place, taking our troubles to God in the form of lament, a prayerful conversation of grief and sorrow, fear and frustration, where we have reached our limit to carry our burdens. We can cry out to God or whisper that sometimes hard to utter four-letter word, help. Opening the door to God for a sit down, a get real talk about what's really bothering us and what's bogging us down. In a real and practical way, we can follow the guides Jesus gave us. They were instructions. When he was asked, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" he said, "You shall love the Lord God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And second is like this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two things, everything else hangs." So partnering with God, co-creating and seeking God's will, sometimes we call it walking the talk. Searching our hearts to hear that small, still voice inside. Doing our part, inviting God into our hearts and our minds with our permission. Giving consent. Do with me as you will. Relinquishing control, surrendering to a power greater than ourselves. Thy will, not mine, be done. Following those messages came the week Courtney shared about God math. Outcomes that make no sense in human terms. How much we can do together in covenant with each other and with our community, prayerfully trusting or not, that God will come alongside of us with options, possibilities, and next steps we had not even think of, but somehow, mysteriously, they appear before us. How impossible it seemed in early spring to meet our fundraising goals. And now, midway through summer, we are well on our way. And although we're taking kind of a resting period, there is so much energy and hope and anticipation for this new phase of how we meet the needs in the community. Last week, we were in the boat with Jesus as the storm raged, threatening death and destruction. His followers cried out, "Teacher, don't you care if we perish?" Jesus calms the storm and asks his followers, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still not have faith?" Here again, these words on faith from William Spurrier. Faith is not blind. It is precisely the opposite. It is an experience of some new truth, new insight, new meaning, which lights up other truths whose connection with each other we could not see before. Trusting God, taking that next faithful step has brought us to today. And what a week it has been. I just want to take a breath there for just a moment before we go on. Thursday night, we opened our doors to our neighbors, and it was quite the eye-opener. Speaking for myself, there were several St. Paul's folks present, but I'll just speak for myself. Can I get a show of hands of who was here that night? There were, in addition to the handful of St. Paul's folks, there were about 13 to 15 neighbors. 3 voices were, I'd say, dominating the discussion. And everyone had many questions that were difficult, and it was kind of glaring that we were unprepared for. Edible Hope was represented by Pastor Britt from St. Luke's and Daniel Wolf, the program director of Edible Hope, and thankfully, their decades of experience were able to field some of the questions around safety and care for the surrounding neighborhood. I think, as St. Paul's, we came away from that discussion humbled. We have started to formulate a plan to address specifically some of the questions raised, and we have already invited our neighbors back for a follow-up conversation in September. We have work to do. We have already outlined some next steps, and honestly, the reality check and temperature check will help us be more prepared and successful as we go forward. I'd like to share unscripted a little bit about Thursday night and since. So Thursday night, we were a small little panel. Folks were given the mic to pass around, asked many questions about what had we done to poll the neighborhood before we made this decision. What are we planning to do to keep the neighbors safe? We have talked about that. What will we do if it's a disaster? Is this really going to happen, or can it be stopped? These were really powerful, somewhat surprising questions. In context, they make so much sense, right? As we said at the beginning, talking about blessed flexibility, we are coming out of a time that has been so traumatic. The shooting that happened toward the end of Share when Brigitta was staffed but had moved to Oregon, and we were, I'm just going to say it, flying by the seat of our pants. We had a lot on our plate, and in hindsight, of course, all these months later, when that was brought up, it was kind of easy to see how we had dropped the ball on talking through that situation with our neighbors. So they had a voice. Honestly, when I left here, I didn't know if I was going to be able to sleep Thursday night. I don't want to say that it was all negative. It was not. There were some folks, just the louder voices were the ones that were fueled by fear and frustration and kind of topics that are so broad. They're not under St. Paul's umbrella in the slightest. And I'm kind of grateful that I didn't have a response to a lot of what was said, because I think they needed to be heard. And I think that's a really good first step to what is coming next. And they really were incredibly helpful in us getting our act together. We need a little wisdom, and we need a little humility going forward. So I left here, called a girlfriend right away to debrief, and then I turned around and drove by St. Luke's. I wanted to see for myself, what are they talking about? What is going to happen to us? Oh my goodness. And I drove by. It was beautiful. It was twilight. There were people in the park right across the street. St. Luke's property was completely bare of any overnighters or camper-outers or drugger doers or whatever it is, that all the things that were thrown out that night. There were a few people who do not have homes who were taking shelter underneath the library awning, very peacefully. There were people walking their dogs. There were still kids and families in the park. It was such a relief. Then I went home and I wanted to know, what are they saying? So I got on Nextdoor, and I know other people got on Nextdoor as well, and there were voices similar to the ones that were the loudest on Thursday night here in this room. But there were a lot of others saying things like, oh, a church doing what Jesus called them to do? That's weird. Stop them. There were some more fears. It's real. Everywhere we go, it is real, and it's different. But as Courtney was reminding me, just because tragedy happens, it doesn't mean that we stop caring for people, that we stop feeding people, that we stop showing up for people, that we stop taking risks for people. We are called to love the very people that were talked about as if they were unlovable. So we're going forward, no worries. And it's very important to take the voices seriously, and we will. That's the thing about St. Paul's. One of the things I love the most is we self-reflect. Humility is kind of the topic of today, and lessons in humility are necessary for growth. And humility is a balanced perspective. We have a handout. I love handouts. I hope no one is put off by those, but I love takeaways, right? Something we can think of through the week. So we have a little adapted handout on humility coming around this morning. Humility is taking honest stock of the strengths and weaknesses of the path we are on, and what work is ours to do. As I said, this is a timely gift when Thursday's conversation. Admittedly, the gift came in an initially hard to unpack, cringeworthy wrapping, and Thursday was a restless night's sleep for some of us. This clearly is our time to be who we are, a small, scrappy faith community with grit, committed to creating a safe space where growth and healing can take place. So let's talk about humility. Humility in practical ways. The word is sometimes hard to separate from humiliation, but humility is far from being shameful or shamed. Humility is a place of growth, a place of balance, and a place of being teachable. An openness to where we need to focus attention for growth and awareness. When tough questions are asked, humility is listening for understanding rather than explaining or defending. It's not easy. Humility is a personal journey. Humility is worth the time and attention it takes. So I'd like to have our small groups talk about humility. What are the challenges of following the calling that is before us? We're not going to solve any problems today. This isn't some kind of a think tank exercise. This is just the way that St. Paul's openly invites reality into the mix, so that when we go forward, we are prayerfully pivoting. When new information presents, we allow the Spirit to guide us forward. So let's talk about that.